Welcome to another broadcast from MindYourHealthcast.com. Now today you see I'm starting out wearing my rose-colored glasses because we're going to be talking about something pretty good. Everything isn't bad. You know, occasionally it appears like the whole world is negative, and it's true, there is a lot of negativity. However, there is also a lot of positivity going on too, and I do keep in touch with all those. I've probably talked more about the negative only to wake you up, but I'm going to be presenting on and off some of the really good positive things, and I have in time past. You may not have noticed it in being overshadowed by all of the problematic areas. Anyhow, what we're going to be talking about today is something to blow your horn about. So, as you will recall, in our last few broadcasts, we were talking about some of the things that have been suppressed and repressed and forbidden that have come along, and unfortunately for us, both health-wise and pocketbook-wise, we have been scammed and we've been had. But while all of this has been happening, however, in the background there have been some other people who have really worked hard at producing good and positive and healthy response in ourselves, as well as reducing the cost. I believe, and I've mentioned this before, as having studied back 200 years now of history of health and medicine, that there came a bifurcation point that was probably the latter part of the 1800s, early 1900s, that we had in this country, and of course the world, the potential of having healthier people and a very low sick bill, or developing a very powerful, expensive sick industry and suffering health-wise. And as I've mentioned before, you have but to look around and look at where we are today health-wise. And if you can honestly tell me that we are healthier today than we were last year or 10 years ago, if the bill is going down because the health is going up, then I would say the current trend that started in the, as I say, late 1800s, early 1900s, if the trend that started then and became what we have today was successful, that would be the outcome. We would have a very small sick bill, and we would have a lot of healthy people. But of course, there's no big profit in that. So you have to consider why it went the direction it did. It's too bad that doctors who way back took the oath to really help people and had very few tools and had healthier people, that trend did not continue. But as always happens, not just with medicine, but pretty much everything, there's always somebody comes along and discovers a way to cash in and make a lot of money, and usually it's at the expense of the people involved that are putting out the money. So we're going to talk about today something I discovered many years ago. In fact, it started way back before a lot of the modern technology that's come along, is that we had an individual who he studied around the world, actually. He was in the military originally, then he ended up spending time in Europe and studying there, and eventually came to the U.S., came back to the U.S. because he was a U.S. citizen, and he settled in Central Florida in the Orlando area. And his name was Dr. Carey Reams. Now, as far as I can determine, he certainly was not a medical doctor, but he was a biochemist, and he was an agronomist, which meant he really was interested in the health of the soil. And early in his life, he became very interested in food and growing and agriculture. And eventually, that was how he really got into the food health field, is that by correcting soil to grow really good food. And So he started growing and tweaking the soil, and he came up with methodologies to test the soil to determine the health value of it. And we're not even going to touch on the soil part of it today, but he developed a whole system, and it was based on something he referred to as the biological theory of ionization, that had to do with ions and the movement of ions in the soil, food, and in human beings. And at the beginning, people were impressed with how well he did. In other words, he could increase the yield and produce very healthy food, and he was quite excited about it. But at the same time, as he was looking around, he noticed that there was an awful lot of sickness. Now, this is many years ago. We're talking way back compared to modern medicine and modern nutrition and everything else. Now, we had talked about before that there were many doctors who discovered back in the early 1900s that one of the major problems with health that was developing was that the soil was becoming depleted and the food was depleted, and therefore people's bodies were depleted, both animals and humans. And that's what opened the door for the introduction of modern chemical medicine to try to manage the symptoms that were being produced in people's bodies who were nutritionally deficient. Now, I know it takes a while for this to really click, but once it does, it's going to make really big sense to you, and that is that no nutrition makes a poorly functioning body, which ultimately ends up having all kinds of deficiency symptoms. Now, we talk about biochemistry, and there is a whole big field of biochemistry, but interestingly, it gets to be a case of you can't see the forest for the trees. So they get all of this minute little biochemical, biomagnetic, bioelectrical things that are going on in the cell, but somehow they miss how this all comes together to form the big picture. We get so analytical, we forget to synthesize, which means to put together. And so that's basically what started happening and continued to happen. And so Dr. Reams noticed, as he was working with the soil and producing good food, he also noticed some improvement in people's health. But the problem he ran into is how do you determine rapidly what you are going to need for that person, starting where they are right now and taking them back to a high level of health. And so he did a lot of study and a lot of contemplation, and at one point suddenly this whole thing hit him about a series of very simple tests that could be done on the urine and saliva that could be inserted into a set of ratios. And I know some people refer to it as an equation, but it isn't really an equation in the sense of a mathematical equation, but it is a set of comparison of different factors and how they come together in terms of body function and balance. And of course, then from that, he was able to determine energy, body energy, and he broke it down into the metabolic energy, how well you have the energy to break down and utilize factors from your food, and the reserve energy, what's in the background, what do we have that will cause us to live long and healthy. And he referred to that as reserve energy. Now, I'm just going to show you this set of numbers. It's kind of interesting. As you see, it's not really an equation, but it is a set of proportions or ratios of numbers. And once I was introduced to this and learned about it and started applying it with my patients years ago, in fact, I started doing this 30-some years ago. And down the road, because of a lot of things that came along and because people were so sick, somehow I got off of it and moved into some other areas. Some of the new electronics, energetic parts of the body and so forth, and systems to measure the electronics of the body, which are still very good. But after giving a lot of consideration, I've decided I'm going to go back to doing these measurements. Now, the nice thing about it, you don't have to go to a big laboratory and pay a lot of money. It can be done in the office, very simple tests in a sense. Once you learn how to do them and put this together, it gives you some very good information about the body. People have thought, well, gee, we got all this sophisticated blood analysis that we do today and all this, and we can find out anything. Well, people don't realize that the standard blood test that you normally would get in a doctor's office gives you very little information as far as the health condition and the nutritional condition of the body. I don't care how sophisticated the tests get. First of all, the blood of certain factors in it are very transitory. That means they come and go pretty fast, they change rapidly, and so they're really not very good. For example, if you got a dose of something that was high in lead, for a little while you would detect that in your blood. But at some point it's going to move out of the blood into the tissue, and then later you would do a blood test and you won't find the lead in there. It would be very unlikely, unless you're continuing to ingest more lead, then you would find some in the blood. But otherwise it's going to diffuse out. If you put mercury into the system, the same thing. Temporarily it's going to be high in the blood, but it's going to diffuse out of the blood into the tissues, and pretty soon you won't be able to find it. And then you would say, oh, well, this person doesn't have a problem with either lead or mercury, so you have to go to some more expensive, more sophisticated methods of getting to that level of metal, because you have to liberate it out of the tissue and get it to be thrown out in the urine before you can really get a good measurement of it. So at any rate, you can't use it for that very well. All of the things that are in the blood on an ongoing basis are kept pretty much level. That's how they were able to arrive at what they call norms, I would call averages. They were able to establish these by measuring huge numbers of people, and they have programs in their computers that constantly tweak it as things change in society as a whole. For example, back in my early days of medicine, I found out that anything over 125, cholesterol-wise, was too high. So most people were averaging 95 to 100 on cholesterol, and these were relatively healthy people. But as the years have gone by and things have changed and the stress on people's lives has changed and our bodies have become weaker and more polluted or contaminated from environmental toxins and so forth, that cholesterol has gone up, so that now what they call normal is not really normal, it's average, as I say, is now gone all the way up to pushing 200. So we've got a big problem in terms of using blood, I think. Now, there's a few cases, like if you have an acute problem going on, you can verify it, but you can also know it without verification. For example, if you had somebody come in, and I've had this happen, who their whites of their eyes were yellow, their skin was yellow, they had fever, and they felt terrible, and they were vomiting and had diarrhea, and their urine was dark brown, I'd say you'd be pretty close to 99% accurate that they had acute hepatitis. Now, you can run a blood test and measure the liver enzymes and find that at that point they are real high, and that could be a verification, but you would pretty well know that they had it without even doing that. In other words, if you're a good diagnostician, more often than not, over time and experience, you can tell pretty much by what's going on symptom-wise what kind of problem is going on in the body. But this is not normal. This is a variation. But I have also had people carried into my office who could not even stand up, and they brought a recent blood test and everything was normal. Now, medicine's inclination is, if they get this kind of situation, to think the person's got a psychological problem and want to put them on an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety agent and want them to see a psychiatrist. That, of course, is unfortunate for the person, because the body, if you keep in mind that the blood is kept normalized by the body because the blood keeps the connection energy-wise, nutrient-wise, and oxygen-wise to all of the tissues of the body, and therefore it's going to try to maintain proper balance of all those nutrients and factors for that. And it's especially protective of the brain and the heart, which are the last things that the body tends to give up unless it's just totally overwhelmed by something. And so, like calcium is extremely important for blood clotting. It's extremely important for neuroconduction. The brain is made up of a high percentage of calcium, and consequently, it's going to keep the calcium level, especially for the clotting purposes. If you were to get a severe injury and started to bleed out, if you didn't have the capability of clotting, a very minor injury could bleed you out and you could die. And so the body's going to make that keep that calcium level. And how does it do that? It's going to pull it from the bone if necessary to keep it level in the blood. And so you have the thyroid and the parathyroids, which keep this balance going between bone and blood. But if you become deficient in calcium, guess what's going to suffer? The bone, because it's going to pull the calcium from the bone and put in the blood. Now, if you were to do a blood test and the calcium is normal, then you'd say, oh, well, everything is fine. But you could find out with an x-ray that the blood looked like the bone looked like Swiss cheese. It would be full of holes because your body has been robbing the calcium from the bone to keep the blood level. So then it's useless in order to do that. And so even with hair analysis, there's certain things you can tell from hair analysis, but there's a lot you can't. And as I've said many times before, you have to know what any given test can tell you and what it cannot tell you. It can be very accurate, giving you certain pieces of information, but it can be very blind at other things. So you can have a very serious condition, and yet the blood test would reflect nothing, and even sometimes, as I say, hair analysis or any of the other testing, even imaging. Certain imaging will give you certain good pieces of information, but others it will not. So the question is then, how are you going to find out what the nutritional energetic condition of the body is? What would be a good test? So here Dr. Reams gets this inspiration. He said it was a divine inspiration. There's no way he could have arrived at it or worked it out himself. Now that's not unusual in the scientific field. The benzene ring that became the core of organic chemistry, one of the major discoveries, was done by a dream from a scientist. And some of the other things, Einstein, it was in his mind by imagination that it came to him about the theory of special relativity. And all of these things, these scientists, I'm thinking of Planck's constant. He arrived at a mathematical constant suddenly out of the blue, and he could not explain how he came up with the number, but it worked perfectly in quantum physics. And so this happens, and so it happens that Carey Reams received in some way this inspiration to come up with this set of numbers, and that represented a really healthy person. And consequently then, he had developed tests that you can do for each of these things. Now, what it tells you in general is, it can tell you how well your body is doing carbohydrate metabolism-wise. In other words, how well are you handling the sugars in your body? It can tell you about the protein. How well are you doing with protein as far as breaking it down and processing the toxic byproduct of it? And from that, here's two major components of metabolism are the carbohydrates and the proteins. And those are extremely important because if you look into the blood type diets that we've talked about before, you find that type A blood needs higher carbohydrates to function properly and lower proteins. You find that type O blood will need higher protein and less carbohydrate. And so a person with an A type blood will do extremely well on fruits and vegetables and no meat. On the other hand, the O blood type, if they don't eat the meat, they become pale, weak, run down, and they get very sickly pretty fast. So it makes a difference. The nice thing about this is that this balance seems to be across the board. If you're able to maintain this pretty close to this 1.5 and pretty close to this 3/3, then you're getting the right balance. Now these other factors on this chart or set of numbers have to do with pHs. The 26.4 was saliva and urine pHs, and those tell you something about the electricity of the body. In my mind, because first of all, pH really is a measure of hydrogen ion concentration, which has to do with hydrogen ions, getting back to the ion idea. So the right amount of those ions make everything work. So it has to do with electricity. If you're more acidic, it's more alkaline. More acidic, you're more positively charged. That's what I want to say. And if you're more alkaline, you're more negatively charged in terms of electrons. There's a few variables in that, and it's beyond what we want to talk about at this point. Sometime if we want to get into pHs again, I have in time past, if you can find one of my broadcasts, talked a lot about pH, because there is a lot of misinformation. People think you can just pour a lot of one type of thing in the body over and over, and that's going to make you healthy. But what it will do, it will shut down your immune system and you feel better, but your body will be going downhill, and that's not good. So anyhow, the two pHs of the urine and saliva give you a pretty good indication of the electrifying capability or the electrical potentials in the body. And that's actually the meter that measures pH is actually measuring the electron-proton count, or the positive and negative charges. And 7, of course, is absolutely neutral. There's an even balance. And so you'll see these two 6.4s indicate that the saliva and the urine both need to be slightly on the acidic side, which would make them slightly positive in terms of electrocharge. And that the blood actually runs slightly alkaline, 7.2 to 3, which is a little bit more on the electronegative side. So you get into something called cations and anions, which is beyond what we want to talk about today, but that's what it's a measure of. And it's been found not only by this formula from Dr. Reams, but by the BEV that we talked about before, bioelectronic Vincent from France, and the doctors in Germany who worked with the system he developed, that they've come up with pretty much the same information, but from a different direction. The 6C in the center has to do with conductance, and that's kind of the pivot point. That needs to be at a certain level to be healthy, and if it goes too high, that means the blood actually is becoming overburdened with toxins. and it's losing its electrical charge. Therefore, the chances of a major cardiac event are likely the higher that number gets. And that one, in conjunction with the two urea and ammonia nitrogen numbers, is what these are, can be a good indicator that you're on the verge of a major cardiovascular collapse or a heart attack. And so this has been verified by another doctor, McDaniels, who found out a lot about the blood and zeta potential, and we've mentioned that before. But anyhow, it's interesting because other people from other areas have verified different aspects of this, and it's interesting that Dr. Reams was able to bring it all together. Now, this O4 has to do with debris being thrown off in the urine, and that gets back to the anabolic-catabolic state. You know, your body is breaking down. It's called a catabolic state. If it's building up, it's an anabolic state. And so this is an indicator of how much you're doing one or the other. Now, again, there's some other ways separately you can test this on another level and understand whether you're in a catabolic or anabolic state. But it's interesting that with this simple group of numbers, he was able to make a determination about the whole body health, and found that by taking key elements and nutrients, it would help bring this back into balance. Now, what he actually did, he started out by just putting the people on a fast and kind of cleaning their body out a little bit. Usually it was short. Sometimes anywhere from 1 to 3 days of drinking water, just pure water, and a little bit of lemon juice with it, and that would cause the body to start flushing some things out. So that's what he started with. Then, by looking at the numbers, and he did them daily when he had people who were extremely sick. And so I have to say that in Florida, once he came up with this, it's interesting because he had people that knew he was working with the soil, and they wondered if he might be able to help them because medicine was unable to get them well. And so that's when he pondered all of this, they came up with this concept. He started working with people. He developed some very inexpensive instrumentation to measure these factors. And sure enough, some people he worked with got well. Well, you know, people getting well when no one can help them, that news tends to spread. And so what happened is that finally some doctors they were unable to help, suddenly were improved, and they said, well, what happened? Well, we went to see this guy, and he did some kind of test, and he changed our diet, and he gave us some specialized supplements, and lo and behold, we got better. As the numbers improved, we did too. And so some of these doctors decided, well, why don't you look at some of my other patients? And then finally, they would have some people in the hospital, and again, this is in Orlando. They would have people in the hospital who were very sick, and so they would ask Dr. Reams to come in and test them and to recommend what they might need to take to improve their health. Well, that was working pretty well, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, the medical people said, you can't bring him in the hospital anymore. And then the medical board decided they were going to get rid of him. And so bottom line is he was forced out of Florida. He then moved up to Georgia, bought property, and set up a health retreat. And there were people eventually coming from all over the world. I mean, he was treating thousands and thousands of people with cancer, about every kind of health problem you can think of, and people were getting well. And that was not good. It was good for the people, but not good for Dr. Reams. So the medical establishment decided they had to get rid of him in Georgia. So it set him out on, he spent the rest of his life actually going from one place to another and working for a while before they ran him out because they did not want the people getting well. Whatever reason would they be against him getting them well very inexpensively, without expensive diagnostic laboratory testing and so forth, and he was able to get people well. Now, I ended up studying with his son-in-law, who was a physicist, who worked with him for quite a while, and looked into the background of why these were important factors and so forth. He was the more technical person, but he knew how to do the testing, how to put the program together for people, and it became very sophisticated, even though it looks very simple. From this, you were able to tell that most people don't give any thought to the fact that there's different forms of calciums, for example. And in this program, you can differentiate several different forms of calcium, which one you need to take, and those are all extremely important. As I mentioned, the brain has a huge amount of calcium, and of course the bone we know about. But the liver, it's very important for liver function to have the right kinds of calcium at the right time. And so as far as I know, this is about the only test out that can tell you which calcium, which form of calcium you need at any given time to bring your body back to a healthy state, especially the liver to a highly functional state. So to me, it's good news. You can much more inexpensively find out what you need to regain your health. It's not designed, never was designed to treat disease, because disease, as it's been defined mostly today, ends up being a nutritional deficiency problem. The symptoms are those of deficiencies: cardiovascular cancer, neurological, immunological, behavioral, all of these, digestive, are big issues related to deficiencies, related to bad food, which is missing everything, related to bad soil. So it gets back to what we said in the beginning. Now, I'm going through all this because I really want to emphasize and get in your mind clear that the fact is that without good food, you're in big trouble. I mentioned how before about how Dr. Royal Lee decided, the dentist, who was also an inventor and a scientist, how he realized how it was a big problem way back in the 1920s, and out of that he developed the first major organic supplementation, and from there on, we had the split. We had people who were out there trying to do things, not trying to, they were doing things that got people well, and then we had the big establishment of commercial food growing and processing, and the pharmaceutical interests who were making a pile of money off of people's health and misfortune, and at the same time convincing them that they have the best there is. It's a big dichotomy, and I'm just hoping that it's beginning to click in your mind if you go back and look at my broadcast, what kind of an education that we're giving you. We're wanting to make you an informed consumer, because paying out $2.7 trillion and being sicker than ever doesn't sound to me like a bargain that we can pay. It's not, because even whether we want to pay, we can't even pay that kind of bill, and it's only going to get worse because people are getting sicker. They're not getting better, and I just wonder, how can we be so blind to see that year after year the diseases are getting worse, people are getting sicker, and the bill is getting higher, and yet being told, oh, we're scientific and we have the answer. They don't have the answer, or we would be better. We would be less unhealthy. And if it weren't for a lot of the people who have turned from medicine and gone on their own and learned about health and nutrition and body detoxification and healthy living, it would even be worse. If everybody were doing the medical system, we would be at 10 trillion. Fortunately, a lot of people have pulled out of the medical system. Now, I'm not saying, again, that there's not certain cases where emergencies, people in a bad accident, and medicine has become very good at putting them back together. And I'm not saying that, unfortunately, if people have let their body deteriorate to the point that something is coming apart, that you might need some surgery. I'm not saying that that's not the case. But I'm saying beyond that, that regular medicine has become a money-generating giant that is bilking the country dry money-wise, and things aren't improving. I just hope that that makes sense to you and it begins to connect. At any rate, I'm glad we were able to get together again, so we'll see what we can dig out of our cauldron for the next broadcast that may inform and maybe irritate you and provoke you into learning more about what you need to do to live healthy in an unhealthy world, which is basically what the bottom line is. It was nice to be with you again. Go to our website, mindyourhealth.com, or mindyourhealthcast.com, and also you can click a link from there to our other site called Alternative Health and Prevention that tells a little bit about what I do. Otherwise, it was nice to be with you again, and in the meantime, be healthy.